Hello and welcome to my channel. Today we talk about the dark side, or the bright side. Let's draw something. Okay, so far so good. What's next? What? You think we're done? Not quite. We forgot something. The shading. Now, what I have done here is called outlines or line art. And yeah, I could end it here actually, depending what I want my drawing to look like. But what if I want to go a bit more into realism? Let's say I want to make it look more three-dimensional. How do I do that? I add shading. But since I draw on a piece of paper with a flat surface, that's not so easy. We don't work with three-dimensional objects here, but we want to create the illusion of three dimensions. And here's the word you need. What are values? Values are your brightest lights, your darkest darks, and everything what's between them. Now, in this video we will talk about values in grayscale, but let me tell you that values are independent from a color saturation or hue. They do not only appear in gray tones, but in color as well. Now, why should we learn about values? Looks pretty simple. A scale from 1 to 10, but before you skip or turn off this video, have a look at this picture and especially at the squares number 1 and 2. Which of those squares is lighter and which one is darker? If you say square 1 is clearly darker than square 2, then you are wrong. If we sample a value from square 1 and drag it over to the right square, you can see that they have the same value. How does that happen? Well, this effect is called relative value, and it's about how light or dark objects seem next to other objects with different values. Now you say, how can that be? The left square is a black one and the right square is a white one. How can they have the same value? Your brain corrects the image automatically, applying logic, telling you that square number 1 must be darker than square number 2, because we know that black is supposed to be darker than white. And there your brain is being fooled. Let's break it apart and try to understand why we see the left square as darker. We identify it as black, although it is not really black, and it's surrounded by white squares, which by the way are also not really white. The right square is supposed to be a white one, although it's also not white. We think we see a white square, but it's a halftone, not more. In addition to amplify the effect, it is surrounded by black squares, which, you guessed it, are also not really black. Furthermore, we can see that the left square is lit by a light source, while the right square lays in shadow. And all these things combined, and our brain simply doesn't get it anymore. In order to learn to see values correctly, you have to unlearn what you have learned, and that sounds really difficult. Especially now that we know that both squares have the exact same value, we still see the left one darker than the right one. Now, here's what you can do, and it's not considered as cheating. No matter what others might tell you, this is what you can do. Grab one of those nice value scales and download it or print it out and use it the old way by holding it against your source photo and your drawing and compare the values. Your drawings will very quickly improve and will look more realistic when you use the right values. Now, let's get away from extreme examples and have a look at something less deceptive. We will use Bernini's David for our example today. Now, a sculpture is an object made in 3 dimensions, and as we know, we can't draw or paint in 3 dimensions. But let's try to apply what we know now. The difference between the chessboard and this sculpture is that the values on the chessboard are 2-dimensional, painted in grayscale. David has values as well, but this time they are caused by light and shadow. Depending on the light source, they can move. When we observe the sculpture, we can clearly see that there are areas which are brighter and darker. And being able to see these differences in brightness is the first step to successfully learn about values. Let's find out where the darkest darks are. But before we begin, let's find our light source, because without light we can't see shadows. You can see that the right side of the face lays in shadow. So is the area where his shoulder casts a shadow underneath the collarbone and on his stomach, because it's covered by the drapery. The areas underneath the drapery are also very dark parts, because light can't hit the surface there at all. It's covered by the folds of the cloth, and the areas where light can't get through are the darkest bits, and most people can see and identify those darks. But there's a problem very similar to the one we had with the chessboard earlier. We are not really sure how dark the values actually are, because we think the drapery is white. See the connection? Unless we use our value scale to check them, of course. Another dark value we can observe on the right side of the neck and fingers, which are turned away from the light source. These are pretty much the darkest areas we can observe. Now let's try the brightest parts, or we can also say highlights. There is one at the elbow, his left thigh, the right thigh, and some spots on his hands and his knees. But we can clearly say that there are more shadow areas than highlights. So when we draw or paint, we often tend to go overboard with highlights and are very stingy with shadows, and we end up with a drawing or painting with very low contrast. And low contrast is the enemy of 3D. Now you say, what about the rest? That's like 90% of the sculpture. Those are called halftones or midtones. Midtones are those values which don't fit inside here or here. And they are areas where light hits the surface, but not really with punch like highlights. And very often it's difficult to see the subtle change in values and to get those right. But they are very important as well. I think one common mistake is that beginners use the wrong equipment when they begin. Don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about brand name articles or expensive drawing or painting equipment. What I mean is the wrong choice of types of pencils. One misconception is that many people think the harder I press, the darker the value gets. But unfortunately, it's not so easy. How dark a pencil gets depends on how much graphite you can find inside the lead. This is a 5H pencil. There are harder pencils like this one, but for me personally it's just right. A 9H pencil, for example, consists of 41% graphite, and 9B has about 93% graphite in its lead. H means hardness, and B stands for blackness. So the higher the number in front, the harder or the darker the pencil. If you want to go dark with your values, you should have at least one pencil on the dark side, such as a 4B or a 5B. And for most of the time they are sufficient. For your halftones I recommend an HB or B. I personally prefer a 2B because I work a lot with pressure and simply don't press that hard. But I talk a lot and show little. Let's get to work. This is one of my drawings, and I'm going to show you how I use my pencils. There are many ways, this is just my way, so feel free to do things differently or to criticize my technique. Let me know in the comments. The darkest parts right here are the areas where the light can't hit the jacket. For that part I use the 5B pencil from Staedtler, but any other brand will do. I use the same pencil for these areas as well. As you can see, I started with a sketch and I fill in the bits and pieces bit by bit. I am a quite slow drawer, but time is not important in my opinion. The areas here and here are darker halftones and I use the 2B pencil, also from Staedtler. Sometimes I use a 3B if I want to give it some extra punch. For the brighter halftones I used an H. The highlights I simply leave alone, the paper is wide enough for me. But even so, there are not really many highlights. This part here is still not done, and I think this part of his collar is pretty much the brightest part. Maybe this one as well. Realistic looking drawings come with the right values, not with color or line art. In order to give your drawing or painting depth, you can't go without values. And from time to time I take my value scale and check if my values are right. There's nothing wrong with it. This is the end of this video. I hope it was somehow helpful. I try to keep it short. If you would like to know more about values or if you want to see more of this drawing here, how I blend and create texture and stuff, let me know in the comments. I'm Chris, this channel is called SpeedDrawFactory. Thank you very much for watching. Check out my other videos. Maybe they are somehow helpful or entertaining. Bye bye and see you in the next video.
And for heaven's sake, don't paint pretty.